Yes, thank you, sir. Mr. Novogradac, nice to see you.
Good to see you.
I once heard someone say about historic tax credits that the building that you're doing should be historic, iconic, and catalytic to change in the surrounding neighborhood. And I remember going to, when I was in medical school in New Orleans and walking down to the streetcar, I'd see an abandoned Sears building, which was just an eyesore. And now you go and it's mixed use. It's really wonderful. But to elaborate on that, because we have scarce dollars, and we want these programs to be catalytic beyond just kind of the only project, but rather to then have an umbrella, if you will, a penumbra, which goes out into other projects. Can you give a couple of examples of those in Louisiana, and hopefully some dollar amounts in terms of what it stimulated, as well as in other parts of the nation?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Senator Cassidy. And let me, first of all, thank you for all the work you did back in 2017 to preserve the historic tax credit. There have been over 8,000 developments moving forward using historic tax credits to revitalize buildings and turn an eyesore into an area gem, thanks to your efforts back in 2017. And I and so many others appreciate you doing that. When I think about there's a lot of various developments across the country that have used the historic tax credit, over 49,000 since the history of the historic tax credit. You know, one property that I know you're familiar with is the World Trade Center there in New Orleans, and it was the gateway to world trade to the south and into Louisiana and to New Orleans for a number of years. And then it went, over time, it went into disarray. And then with Hurricane Katrina, it was essentially abandoned. And then in the combination of the historic tax credit along with the new market tax credit enabled that property to be revitalized and now is a very active and desirous hotel and housing and a centerpiece, turning an eyesore into a gem. But I also wanted to note, when I think about the historic tax credit, it has declined in value, as I noted in my introductory testimony and in my written testimony over the last number of years. And there's been a variety of Treasury regulations that have reduced the value of the credit and some some tax law changes that have impacted the value. It went from $1 in credit value down to 79.80 cents. So it's seen a 21% decrease in value. And I think as Congress thinks about the tax bill next year, looking at ways to enhance the value of the historic tax credit would be super helpful. And I have a number of ideas, which I'd be happy to share. Yes.
Ask, partly, is that decline in value because overall rates went down under the Tax Cut and Jobs Act? No.
No, it was not because of the decline in the tax rate. It was because there was a court decision that froze the market, and then as a consequence, Treasury issued a safe harbor that became the norm. And that safe harbor that issued by Treasury.
Elaborate on that, please. The safe harbor became the norm.
That's right. There was a safe harbor in terms of how you'd have to design certain types of historic tax credit developments in order for the IRS to say there's economic substance to the investment.
When you say design, you mean the financing package?
That's correct. That is correct.
Okay, please continue.
And then a few years later, the IRS issued a ruling about how the taxable nature of the historic tax credit affects investors. And that put an additional tax burden on investors, which further
and what was that IRS regulation?
That was a regulation that is called, it's an interpretation of Code Section 50D, and it's super wonky, but it basically imputed income for using the tax credit to certain investors. And that imputation of income meant that investors wouldn't pay as much for the tax credit because of this imputation of income.
I see. So they were both given and taken away at the same time.
That's
right. And therefore, they decreased the value of the credit.
That's right.
Okay. And that was new because we've had tax credits at least since Reagan, maybe before.
That's correct.
So this was a new IRS deliberation on an old product. Can I ask what led to this?
That's correct. It was a new IRS interpretation of existing structures that were being used in the market.
Now, to be sure, just because I think we all need to know this, I went to one site in New Orleans where it was a bar or a restaurant that was used during Jim Crow by African Americans for them to have a social club, and the restrictions on how you could develop were significant. You had to preserve the historic integrity, and the building being so old was not that nice anymore, and so you had to take something which was a little dog-eared with historic significance and enhance the historic significance, et cetera. So there is a higher cost basis for doing so.
That is correct. The foundation of the historic tax credit is designed to help offset the cost of retaining the historic integrity of the building, and that's the original genesis of the credit back before 1986.
I'm out of time. Thank you. I yield.